We need bold action to deal with the global catastrophic risks we face. The threat of nuclear war has been with us for decades. I grew up in the 1980s as a teenager, believing that we would not last a decade. I took part in the protests here in the UK in 1983, 84, 85, 86. We were worried that the descent into confrontation, driven by President Reagan at the time, describing the Soviet Union as the evil empire, was driving us to the brink of destruction. And actually, we were more right than even we realized, since in retrospect, we've learned about the NATO exercise Able Archer that was misinterpreted by the Soviets at the time as a real preparation for nuclear war, or the incident with Stanislav Petrov, who saw he was a Soviet commander in the army looking at the threat of missiles coming in, early warning, and his systems were telling him that the Soviets were under attack. He chose not to relay the message to his higher command in the belief that this was a glitch. But he said afterwards it was a real knife-edged call, and if he had communicated further up, then it would in all likelihood have led to a nuclear retaliation. So in 1983, we were living in very dark times. I think they were darker than today, but I'm a nuclear analyst who is not necessarily in the majority opinion there. There are many that believe we are very close to confrontation that could slide into nuclear war today. But we sit in a much more complex situation. We've gone beyond a binary Cold War confrontation with multi-polarity and the rise of China and slide into increasing confrontation. We have, of course, also the emergence of new weapon systems, new nuclear weapon systems, but also the possibility of new novel biological weapons and other technologies that have been racing ahead. And all of this leads to a loss of control. And meanwhile, of course, our own consumer lifestyles across the world are driving ecosystem loss, biodiversity collapse, climate change, which is terrifying, and the emergence of other disruptive technologies that are not necessarily military in nature, artificial intelligence, digital duplication, a whole host of other technologies that raise questions about how we maintain control as we move forward. There's no shortage of people that can come up with solutions or answers to some of these questions, but those answers are only ever partial, and in the end, they rely upon agreement. When I gave the talk at a Quaker Council for European Affairs in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, I was doing so just after the states came together in the United Nations to discuss the summit for the future and agree the pact for the future. It's an important document that is a sort of pathway towards how states should cooperate more to tackle some of these challenges, outlining those challenges and the principles of the approach. But it felt like it was in a parallel universe, because while states were having these conversations, we were witnessing two significant regional wars, that both of which could spiral into global confrontation in the Ukraine war and in the Middle East. And Israel, of course, has continued to engage in confrontation with most of its neighbours in a seven-front conflict, and those neighbours are responding with all sorts of challenging military responses, and people side on one side or the other, and the confrontation continues. In Europe, we are encouraged to support ever-increasing defence expenditures as we are drawn into confrontation, further confrontation with Russia. We're being encouraged to support long-range strike systems into Russia, which is inevitably one step closer towards NATO and Russia being in direct confrontation. All of these things feel like it's an overwhelm. And they demand massive transition in the way we do things, in what we do. They demand changes in how we govern ourselves. Those confrontations between the great powers, the United States, Russia, China, the European Union, they seem to be going in the wrong direction. We seem to be unable to manage the way we adjust power in the world, because those of us in Europe and the United States need to understand that if we resist this power transition towards a multipolar world, if we insist on maintaining our colonial grip on most of the world, we will be in confrontation and we will be responsible alongside those that challenge the existing structures. We need instead to be building trust, and we need to be changing the way we consume. Because what's happening is that we are taking part in a process where the collective responsibility and the collective capacity to deal with these issues is eroding. It's difficult as human beings to look at all of this and not to experience overwhelming despair. In fact, that is appropriate. It's important that we listen to that and to understand that we don't have the answers. Let me deal with a few significant traps I observe in these processes. The first trap I would like to outline is around human nature. How many times have you heard people say, perhaps you've said it yourself, it's all hopeless because, of course, at root, human nature is all about self-interest. When we talk about rational choice, rational means self-interest. We need to be thinking about what the incentives are for individuals or particular groups to engage in cooperative behavior because they won't otherwise. It's natural human nature. Politics is about the art of control and confrontation because human beings are about self-interest. And as a result, we get attached to confrontation because it's natural. And as a result, we slide into this very clear binary that we have to dominate or we will be dominated. And in this very deep binary us versus them, we demonize the other, we dehumanize them. We start to talk about them, think about them as animals, as different from ourselves, as brutalized, as only understanding violence. And all too often, we slide into this mirroring that happens. I was once a TV talk show host on state Iranian television. It's a bizarre point in my life. I was invited as a defense analyst to come onto Iranian TV, as I am onto many TV channels. And after a while, having commented on numerous confrontations, they invited me to host a talk show on politics around the region and around the globe. And it was a salutary experience. It gave me a great deal of humility when I assumed that I had something clear and obvious to say. I learnt a lot about the Iranian mindset, and I learnt a lot about the sense of victim status that they have, this sense that they have been disrespected over the years the way in which the West has engaged in colonial approaches to dominate Iran and the region. It's another frame. It's neither right nor wrong, but it's an important frame for us to open to understand better if we are to engage with the Iranians, whether confrontationally or cooperatively. I've recently also started a new organization with some colleagues called the Global Stability Network. We view the rise of China as a real issue that the West is misreading and feeling like they are inevitably having to engage with confrontationally. Everything the Chinese do is seen through the lens of a threat to the West. Seen from China's perspective, they see themselves as having been manipulated and suppressed for the last 200 years. They talk about the period of humiliation. They see Western colonialism living on today, and they see themselves as at last being in a position where they can challenge that colonialism. And so you see a zero-sum confrontation. But this is in nobody's interests. And it is most definitely not an effective way of going about relating to China. Instead, what we need to be doing is seeing the positive possibilities of building a more integrated system, integrated economies, integrated collective security systems. But we can't do that if we think that we have the answers and that their culture, their way of doing things is a threat to us. And that goes in both directions. Okay. Related issue, related trap number 2, sense of righteousness. I've certainly experienced it. I often slip back into it, even today. I feel that I do have answers. I feel that my way of being in the world is superior to them. When I was on those streets protesting in the early 1980s, I had clarity that nuclear weapons were bad. We needed to get rid of them. Those people that were engaged in nuclear deterrence were threatening the annihilation of millions of people. And in so doing, they were the problem, and I was the solution. Or rather, everybody on my march was the solution. I had another experience it must have been around 2008 or 9 when I was teaching at the National School of Government. I was teaching systems thinking, which involves both holistic thinking, seeing the bigger picture, the context, and using tools to draw us out of our shallow perspectives. But also, it's about seeing things from others' perspectives, drawing them into the decision-making processes, understanding that decisions taken from involving a diversity of perspectives were more robust, were better decisions than those taken by small groups. And the participants were largely senior civil servants. And I remember one of them coming up to me and saying, I think what you're doing here is really amazing. I think that the tools you're giving us, I can totally see how I'm going to be using these in my work. But what I don't understand is how you can use them in your political work. And I looked at him and I realized in that moment that I was seeing the whole process from a place of righteousness. I had the tools that I was giving him, they needed to change, and I continued along my own traditional ways of engaging in politics. And it was in that moment that I made a decision to explore how I could engage in politics without the righteousness, without the clarity that I had the answers. I have ideas, I have a perspective. Both of them are valid. I have something to contribute, but so does my political adversary. So do those that have a very different trajectory, a different legacy, a different political lens to mine. And it is in the engagement that we strengthen. I once had quite a few confrontational engagements with a man called Rear Admiral John Gower, who was the most senior uniform in the Ministry of Defence responsible for Britain's nuclear weapons policy. But in those confrontations, I think there was also a certain degree of humanity. We listened to one another and we found the wisdom and the truth in what the other was saying, even whilst we disagreed with it. And when John retired, we had several conversations which led us to collaborate on a number of projects. And there was one time when I found myself in New York, staying with John in an Airbnb in the Bronx, and we were traveling into the United Nations together for meetings on nuclear disarmament diplomacy. I had a particularly important meeting with the Swedish foreign minister to finally sell a particular idea that I had that the Swedish foreign ministry was keen on. And in this final sell, I was trying to convey that the Swedes had an opportunity to change the way nuclear disarmament diplomacy was done. And the foreign minister was skeptical, primarily because she came from the same disarmament cloth as I did. And in the last moment, I decided to take John with me to the meeting. And we went into the room. Foreign Minister had a very large contingent of officials. There was John and myself and another colleague. And I introduced myself as from the peace movement with a clarity of perspective around the need for nuclear disarmament, how my views had not changed dramatically, but that my methods had. And then I handed over to John. And John described himself as coming from the nuclear deterrent community with a lifetime of commanding nuclear weapon submarines and engaging in policy relevant to nuclear weapons. And he said that his views on nuclear deterrence had not changed significantly, but that his methods had, and that he was there to endorse my project for changing the way we do nuclear disarmament diplomacy. And in that moment, the sale was made. I didn't need to express more about the project. Let me describe another trap. This trap is a focus on analysis, evidence, and policy. These are important. It's really crucial that governments and other organizations base their policy on good analysis, on the evidence. But we also need to understand that it's more than that. It's about the stories we tell one another. It's about the relationships there are between us. So that when we make conclusions coming away from our analysis and evidence, we also include an awareness of the audience, of the communication, of the listening and the communicating and the nature in which we go back and forth. Moving on from the traps, let me talk a little bit about the crisis that I perceive in the way we're doing politics. And this operates at both the international and the domestic level, and right down to the local. It's the core of what I want to talk about today. Because, as I've said, I think our perception of politics is mistaken, and it is self-fulfilling. We see politics as all about confrontation, as about us and them. We even have our institutions that we hold sacred based on confrontation. we have the accusation, we have the in the courts, we have the barristers for the defense and the prosecution. We have, certainly in this country, a politics where we have government and opposition. We have in schools encouraging children to engage in debate. It's less important what you believe, but that you debate it vigorously and that you marshal your case effectively. But I think that politics can be different from that. It doesn't need to be about game playing. It doesn't need to be about self-interest and promotion of one's own perspective. It doesn't need to be about deviousness or even, at the most extreme, killing your opponents. It doesn't, but it also doesn't need to be about clarity and certainty in public communication. And then when opponents meet in private, they compromise and they come up with some kind of accommodation. We can trust our publics to engage with greater maturity in politics if we talk about the opportunity there is of actually engaging with an open mind, with a listening approach, with an ability to articulate one's perspective with clarity, but with openness and curiosity. Because it is in doing that that we can build trust and relationships that can work, that can avoid the disconnect that we fall into. Let me talk a little bit about some of the values and the approach that I'm talking about here. First and foremost, I think what I'm talking about is humility. I was invited to participate in a conference in Moscow a few months ago. Now, whether we realize it or not, we are in confrontation with Moscow, I would say proxy war. We deny it, but we are. And there I was traveling to Moscow and talking with my country's enemy. And I was on a panel talking about the Middle East. And I knew that if I went there and talked about condemning the action in Ukraine or condemning the action of the Russians in Syria or anywhere else, that not only would I not actually get through, quite rightly, because I would be missing the whole picture, but also it would be dangerous. But there I was in Moscow giving a talk on the Middle East, and I realized that the way to get through to them was to express and feel the humility and the gratitude I had for having the opportunity to speak. So I opened my talk recognizing my shame. I was very personal about the sense I had as a British person with much engagement in the Middle East, of the feeling of responsibility I have for the damage my community has done to that part of the world and continues to do to this day. I talked about the addiction that is in my community towards colonial attitudes, towards domination, that continues today and emerges on the streets as we riot or as in the racism that is experienced in our society. That the attitudes that my fellow countrymen have towards other societies is reprehensible. And of course, having said that, and also I talked about the embarrassment I felt about being a British person on a panel in Moscow talking about the Middle East, when really we needed to be listening to people from the region. But that also gave me the opportunity to talk about how we needed to help each other overcome the addictions we have to these types of attitudes. These attitudes that drive us to support invasion of countries on the other side of the world or next door. And after my talk, I was approached by a small group of young officials from the Foreign Ministry who asked me whether they were better off working on the inside or the outside. And it broke my heart. It was incredibly courageous of them to approach a foreigner from a country that their country was in confrontation with and to show their vulnerability there. And it opened me to the sense and the power of vulnerability and humility when it comes to engaging in politics. Because we need to be vulnerable to one another, particularly those that we see as our enemies or adversaries, because it is only in that vulnerability and the humility that we can transcend the confrontation, those confrontations that are destroying our capacity to address the global catastrophic risks we face today. So we need to be reframing the engagements we're in, building the relations and the capacity, and recognizing that this is not about winning. This is about building relationships. It's about inclusion. It's about processes that are deliberative and that are open in nature. And most of all, it's about listening with compassion. And it's this that has led me to formulate a new approach to the way in which we in Britain are engaged in the conversation on nuclear weapons. Because up until now, we have basically focused on the question, should Britain have nuclear weapons or not? And so many people in Britain interpret this as an invitation to make ourselves unacceptably vulnerable. We shouldn't be getting rid of our nuclear weapons unless they get rid of theirs, is the traditional response. And that is the majority response. But what it's led to is the control of the narrative by those that see nuclear weapons as essential and unavoidable tools in a dangerous world. And I don't think that is where most British people are. I think they want to see nuclear disarmament. They just don't think that Britain should do it alone. So I'm looking at changing the question towards what is it that Britain can do to drive genuine global nuclear disarmament. And the only way Britain can drive genuine global nuclear disarmament and to escape the traps we're in is by engaging with our adversaries and understanding the fears and the strategic drivers that lead them to deploy nuclear weapons, to have the doctrines and the postures that they have, and to change mutually together. But I'll leave you with this thought, because it is my vision that drives this talk and drives the way I engage today. It is a vision that we see politics as an opportunity to be vulnerable, to understand and to manage the complexity that means that there are no simple answers. There are probably no solutions to the wicked messes that we face. How do we overcome this addiction that we have to confrontation and to consumption that will inevitably lead to our own demise unless we change? But we can only change by listening, by learning, and by growing together, by opening to the fact that we have some answers, but they're just our answers, and they have their answers, and they have their wisdom, and we can learn from that wisdom. We can learn from the Chinese when they think about and they approach the world with a sense of collective engagement from the group rather than the individual. They can learn from us when we talk about individual human rights and the recognition that it doesn't work to oppress or suppress particular groups when they are not given enough space. We can learn from the Chinese when it comes to relational engagement. We can learn a huge amount. And we need to inhabit this world together with humility, respect, and listening. And thank you for listening.